All right, so hello, my name is Deborah Hurd, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's special event. This event is being hosted as a part of the Department of Black Studies at the University of Nebraska Omaha's 50th anniversary. Yesterday, November 10th, marked the 52nd anniversary of the Omaha 54. And I'd like to thank Claire Delaney, who is Outreach Archivist in the UNO Chris Library's Archives and Special Collections, for composing and emailing to the campus an overview of the historical significance of the day, complete with a picture. For those of you joining us for the first time, on November 10th, 1969, 54 Black UNO students staged a sit-in protest in the president's office for his failure to address issues of racial discrimination and cultural relevance on this campus. While peacefully protesting, the police were called and these 54 students were arrested. Omaha's Black civic, social organizations and churches mobilized to bail out and support these students with their demands. One of their demands was the creation of a Department of Black Studies, which was established 2 years later in 1971. And 50 years later, we are here and continue to chart our path forward because of the courage of the Omaha 54 and the continued support and backing of the Black community in Omaha. We salute you and we thank you. As a discipline that reflects upon, studies, and critiques the continuing effects of historical enslavement, colonization, and land dispossession, we cannot help but acknowledge that this university sits on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American people for whom this city is named, the Omaha, and that of other First Nation people who regarded this land as their communal homeland. We stand in solidarity with you, especially now during Native American History Month. And in the spirit of liberation and self-determination out of which this discipline and this department emerged, we stand in solidarity with the people of Ethiopia who desperately want to live in peace, safety, and freedom. As in past weeks, we continue to stand with and support the students of Howard University, the people of Sudan, and the people of Haiti in their protests and in their trials. It is with all of these ideals and concepts in mind that we gather here tonight. Leading us in this very important discussion will be Professor Terry Crawford. Professor Terry L. Crawford is an adjunct professor here in the Department of Black Studies. She situates herself as an activist, advocate, historian, writer, and educator at the intersection of social justice, community engagement, and public policy. Professor Crawford earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Paralegal Studies and Legal Administration from the College of St. Mary in Omaha, and a Juris Doctorate from the Creighton University School of Law. Her research and scholarship integrate issues of race in the law, critical legal theory, criminology and criminal justice, and the foundations of American law. She has a long history of advocating for marginalized voices in the courtroom, the classroom, and the community. She serves as president of the Omaha Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the public policy director for the League of Women Voters Greater Omaha Chapter, is a past legal redress chair for the NAACP, and most recently, she's been appointed as the University of Nebraska Omaha's Community Fellow for the Addressing Redlining Through Service Learning and Community Engagement Initiative. In her quest to contribute to the building of a more just world, she lives by the mantra, facta non verba, a Latin phrase meaning deeds, not words. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Crawford.
Thank you so much, Professor Hurd. I really appreciate the opportunity that we have tonight to have this very valuable discussion. Thank you so much for paying homage to the Omaha tribe and others that you mentioned. I just also would like to mention that today is the 11th of November, which is Veterans Day. And for those that gave the ultimate price as a result of their service to this country, particularly Black and Brown and Latinx that served and gave their lives to a country that has always not been kind to us. So we also want to make sure that we acknowledge them today. I am ecstatic about our panel today, so I will get to our introductions. First, we have Darrell Douglas, who is the JailBased Voting Initiative organizer for the Sentencing Project. He also has worked with voting coalitions and other initiatives in moving the meter on democracy. He is experienced community organizer and advocate and activist in the progressive criminal justice realm. And after 5 years in corrections, rising to the rank of lieutenant for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, he also has firsthand knowledge in the inner workings of the Texas prison system and the impact on those incarcerated and their families. He has devoted his life to creating a world where fewer Black people, poor people, or otherwise those that have been disenfranchised people have less of a chance to end up involved in the justice system. Following his career in corrections, Mr. Douglas worked as a legislative staffer for the Texas State Representative Alma Allen as her Corrections Committee portfolio. In 2014, he founded Houston Justice, a grassroots organization aimed at impacting local and statewide reforms in Houston, Texas, where he spearheaded Project Orange, the county jail's initiative to register eligible voters. Thank you so much, Darrell Douglas, for joining us. Next, we have Christina Minsick. She is an advocate and organizer who convenes the Democracy Behind Bars Coalition in Massachusetts, in partnership with the African American Coalition Committee based in MCI Norfolk. With coalition partners, Christina leads campaigns in Massachusetts to end jail-based disenfranchisement, felony disenfranchisement, and prison gerrymandering. Her goal is to eliminate barriers to political participation and build political engagement behind the walls. Christina has organized around these issues with the National Council, excuse me, for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls in Common Cause Massachusetts, and the Mass Power Vote campaign to restore voting rights to all incarcerated citizens in her state. Christina first worked on ending felony disenfranchisement as a research fellow at the Scholar Strategy Network. She became politicized and committed to democracy reform while a student at Hearst University, majoring in peace and justice studies. She also concentrated on the role of special interests, political inequity, and big money in US policy towards the Middle East. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for joining us, Christina. And we also have Tony Gant. Mr. Gant is the Mid-Michigan Regional Coordinator and Policy Analyst for Nation Outside. Nation Outside is a Michigan-based organization that is run and founded by formerly incarcerated people dedicated to criminal justice reform. Directly impacted people should have the power to impact the political process so that their communities are safe and vibrant with real opportunities and support for people who have been incarcerated. Excuse me, let me take a drink briefly. Mr. Gant himself has lived experiences as a former incarcerated person himself within the Michigan Department of Corrections for 20 years, from 1995 to 2015. Mr. Gant has organized successful campaigns surrounding housing and employment for directly impacted people. His work also currently with incarcerated people around their experiences of COVID while incarcerated, with the focus on people serving long sentences, including life sentences. He's currently working to improve jail voting in the state of Michigan. Mr. Gann is a 2021 Leading with Conviction Fellow with Just Leadership USA. He is a father, an author, and a business owner. Thank you so much. I appreciate each one of you for being here tonight to have this discussion. Thank you. So let's start our discussion here. We all know from the research that there's an estimated 536,000 individuals who are held in local jails who are awaiting their trials, have not been convicted of anything, and basically they're sitting because they live in poverty or because of their status of being under the poverty guidelines. This is more than 20% of the United States total incarcerated population. And for those that fall into this category, there are two critical elements necessary for them to be able to cast their vote because they still have that right. Two things that are missing is the information and the access to democracy while they are waiting pre-trial. So let's talk about what your experience has been like in each one of your states regarding the process to move towards voting for this pre-trial detention population. Darrell, why don't we start with you and talk some about what that looked like, not just in your city, but through your work through the Sentencing Project?
Absolutely. So back in 2018, for the first time, we were able to take volunteers behind bars at the Harris County Jail to do basically voter registration and voter education. This came about because the year before, I'd been reading an article in the Atlantic magazine that basically pointed out some of the facts that you just mentioned. And having come from working in the criminal justice system at a prison, combined with like my community organizing work, I wondered what that mechanism looked like. Because coming from the penitentiary, I knew there wasn't anything there, and I just wondered, like, what might that look like at the Harris County Jail? I also remembered spending a couple of nights at the Harris County Jail myself, and I didn't remember at any point during orientation. It was one night each time, but in both cases, neither was there information or access to a ballot. And so I was shocked to find that not only was there not this information, and not only was there not this access, but those who were in charge, those who were elected, and those who had risen through the ranks and that were running these institutions, be it the elections department, the jail itself, the sheriff's department, no one knew. No one knew what the rules were. And so when presented with this, we sort of started going down this path that ended up resulting in the opportunity for voter registration, as well as this year for the first time, a polling location at the Harris County Jail. And I would say, looking nationally, it's different in every state, but the one thing that is consistent, the one consistent thread that exists, is that in every state, we're falling behind when it comes to access and when it comes to information, and that disenfranchisement, if we really want to talk about voting rights, we really want to talk about disenfranchisement, it's this area that I think is the most profound consistently across the nation.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that. Christina. Mm-hmm.
Sure, thank you. And also thanks so much for having me on in this space with you all. It's great to be here. So in Massachusetts, our organizing around jail-based voting, I think the first thing that I want to point out is that it's been an inside-outside project. A lot of the work kicked off after members of a group called the African American Coalition Committee, which is based in MCI Norfolk and leads all of this work with us, realized after the fact that they had various members, including their chair, Alameen Patterson, realized after the fact that they had been eligible to vote while pre-trial for the election of Barack Obama. That was a catalyzing experience because I think, needless to say, for Al-Amin, he speaks about realizing after the fact that he missed out on the opportunity as a Black man in the US to vote for our first Black president when he, or sorry, that was in 2016, when he had the right to vote. We also, fortunately, have a number of folks, some are faith leaders, some are local League of Women Voters groups, others are kind of various community organizations who have over the past like 7 or 8 years organized jail-based voting initiatives on their own. In the summer of 2020, we came together as a formal coalition for the first time. And I think that what's important about that experience is because of COVID, we had virtually no access behind the wall to do voter registration, to distribute absentee ballot applications, and the like. And I think for every member of our coalition, that just kind of hit the nail on the head, that the job of administering elections cannot and should not be the job of volunteers and independent organizations. So since then, we can touch on this later too, but we've turned a lot of our efforts to passing legislation at the same time that, including in our municipal elections this fall, we've continued to lobby every level of government, our elections officials, our Secretary of Commonwealth, our Attorney General, our legislators, and of course sheriffs to do their part to provide meaningful access to the ballot.
Okay, thank you for that, Christine. And yes, we do want to talk about that legislative piece. Okay, Tony?
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me into this space. This is a super important issue. For Michigan, it's kind of interesting, right? Because I was released from incarceration in 2015. So jail voting obviously was happening before I was released. But and I don't know about other states, but in Michigan, you have 83 separate counties, right? 83 separate counties with 83 separate county sheriffs. Of those 83 counties, you have 81 county jails that hold people over 48 hours. And so those are kind of like 81 separate voting systems. And in some instances, no voting system, right? And so what was happening in Michigan was that in some jails, right, volunteers were allowed in, League of Women Voters, local community activists would go in and register people to vote for certain elections. And it was kind of a patchwork of what's happening, right? And so activists, we were often playing like hopscotch around the state, trying to find the best county jail like that we could organize in and hopefully get some people access to the ballot. But at some point we kind of stepped back and thought about the process of that with all these county jails, the overwhelming majority were not allowing people to vote, either because people didn't know, there was no structure in place that allowed access to the ballot. The process was very complicated for people housed in jail to register, to request an absentee ballot. The rules for voting in the state of Michigan don't lend themselves well to people held in jail. I'll just say it like that. They don't lend themselves well to that. And so as a result, and I want to thank the Sentencing Project for funding us, we took a step back and we did a statewide report on jail voting in Michigan. We did FOIA requests to every jail. We collected all the data and we synthesized and wrote a report that details how jail voting is and is not working in the state of Michigan. And as a result of that, we're now on the path of trying to get some legislation dropped in Michigan to address a lot of those issues.
Okay. Thank you so much for those details. That's a very good transition into our next question regarding those FOA requests. And I believe all three of you have mentioned the League of Women Voters. I am policy director for the League of Women Voters for Greater Omaha. So we know what it's like to have those conversations with Department of Corrections and with the sheriffs and trying to get cooperation. A lot of those organizations feel as though it's sufficient to either do mail-in ballots or something similar to that rather than a full-blown polling place. So if each of you could talk about some of those challenges that you had with getting administration on board, some of the resistance I'm sure that you met in this whole process, and whether or not after that resistance there was actually some cooperation on the inside to work towards something more uniform, like you talked about. Tony, why don't we start with you first?
So I'll say I was kind of naive, right? I thought when you think about that there's a constitutional right at stake, when I began to talk to sheriffs, they will understand, hey, this is a constitutional right. Let's find a process that works for everyone. But one of my early encounters with sheriffs was that, they didn't think it was really important, and that most people in their jail probably wouldn't participate anyway, and that the most they were willing to do was to put up a poster. And so it was kind of shocking to me, the more conversations I had as to how people held in jail are viewed when it comes to their access to the ballot, right? But there were highlights. We have a great sheriff in the county of Genesee. And that sheriff in Genesee County in Michigan has become the model for the state in his advocacy around making sure that people in his jail are afforded access to the ballot. But he is in the minority. He's in the minority, actually. And so because all sheriffs in Michigan are elected officials, they have a great deal of power as elected officials. And so just kind of stepping back, I'm not sure, and my position is that we can't really change it county by county or sheriff by sheriff. Was that a good answer?
Yeah.
I want to make sure. Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Christina, can you also talk about some of the challenges and resistance and obstacles that you were met with in trying to get administration to understand the importance of that population having access to the ballot?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first I want to echo something that Tony said about the reality of access behind the wall in Michigan, which is that it really is a patchwork. So while we have sheriffs here and there who were willing to work with us, and who also, a couple, I believe, genuinely care about voter participation. The reality is there are kind of two things. One is just that basically up till the present, sheriffs have been able to get by with providing no access to the ballot. So that's a really tough place to start from. And what we're essentially trying to do is build an entire voting system behind the wall from the ground up, which kind of goes into my second point, which is just that jail-based voting isn't a kind of quick fix problem. So we found that even with those sheriffs who wanted to be helpful, wanted to work on this, there was really only so far those sheriffs were willing to go. For example, having a group of volunteers come in for maybe 2 one-hour sessions and help whoever heard about the session or could access it, which is especially complicated given shutdowns because of COVID and programming that hasn't started back up, to maybe reach a dozen people. I want to give the example that in one of the counties where, the sheriff is committed to the principle of voter participation. He started a civics education course that's exciting and I know has had something maybe like 10 students in it. And based on the data that we were able to get, 13 people voted in 2020. And that's out of an estimated 300 to 400 eligible voters. So if we're talking about like the gold standard, the most cooperative sheriff, the reality in that jail is a 3% participation rate. That's a bigger problem. So I think the challenges that we encountered, I'll try and be brief, broke down into kind of 4 main problems. One is there were totally some sheriffs who had never thought about this before. I had one sheriff say, actually tell me he hadn't thought about ballot access before, and that if theoretically an incarcerated person wanted to vote, that person could write the sheriff a letter requesting a ballot application.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, rough starting point. And there's definitely issues around just knowledge behind the wall. So some sheriffs were willing to put up know your right signs. And so that was great in those instances. But then too, most sheriffs weren't willing to go very far to provide folks with access to ballot applications, materials on candidates, or all the other basics that someone would need to vote by mail. 3, we have issues with ballot applications getting rejected, getting caught in jail mail delays. And we found I have had more conversations than I would like with elections officials who didn't even know that there were eligible incarcerated voters. 2020 was the first time we were able to get our Secretary of Commonwealth to issue guidance to elections officials on what to do with applications from incarcerated voters. And I got calls from town clerks who I'd met with saying, oh, good news, the law had changed. So there's an issue also on the administrative side with election officials and the Secretary of Commonwealth too. And then the last piece is getting any data has been an enormous barrier. I mean, you know, if we can't, I really was on, so I guess the context in Massachusetts, if I wanted, I could theoretically get data on participation by incarcerated people if I went to all our 360 some town clerks and asked them to get that data to me individually, but there's not a requirement that that even is tracked in the first place. So I had some write me back, but yeah, so we can't improve what we can't measure, and the lack of access to data you know, is a huge barrier in and of itself.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Darrell, you want to talk about your experience with those obstacles and some of that resistance through your work with the Sensing Project?
Absolutely. So, you know, Freedom of Information Act requests, okay? Sure, it says they have a certain amount of time, but they're going to give you the runaround. Okay, 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, you know, we reserve the right to request an extension. That, I mean, there were some counties who did that kind of like more than once and then sent something saying they don't have anything anyway. And it's like, you couldn't have done this from the beginning. I'll say with the work in Texas, what was really, as far as obstacles, because it's not just the jail that you're dealing with, right? So even within just the Harris County system, you have the sheriff who's over the jail, but then you have an elections administration department who has its own budget, who has its own like priorities. And so sometimes there would be times where the sheriff is all in, but the clerk, the county clerk or the elections administrator is throwing a flag on a place somewhere. And so there's a lot of bureaucracy there, but even within the jail, there were times where the sheriff gave a thumbs up, but a jail is a hierarchy. So under the sheriff, you have chiefs, and under those chiefs, you have assistant chiefs, and then majors, and then captains. And so there's a lieutenant somewhere who's a cog in the gear. And so you know, we thought X was going to happen, but it didn't, and we didn't find out until the very end. So I'll be remiss if I didn't mention Dana Pekowski, Blair Bowie, and the team at Campaign Legal Center. Because for us, we had forward momentum And then, you know how you can kind of tell that everybody on the other side has just agreed to give you the runaround in a nice way? That's kind of what
Yeah.
happened. And so Dana Pakowski, over the course of a couple of weeks, sat down with us and came up with this very lawyer-esque memo. They got some get right out of them. Okay. So it went from like, oh, this is cute, there's some activists that want to do this thing, to like, oh, like we could be litigated, you know.
Right.
So that sort of changed it. But yeah, when talking about those challenges, they exist, but just figuring out another way to get things done is kind of the name of the game.
Okay, thank you so much. Each of you mentioned some of that bureaucracy that you had to deal with, and even having the conversations, or even assuring that people understand the importance of this. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the myths that also come up in this whole process about whether or not this population is even interested in voting. There are lots of myths in the research and in some of the contacts that I have made, that you have made, regarding whether or not the sheriffs and the hierarchy even want to take the time, because they are of the mindset that these individuals don't want to vote anyway. Talk about those myths about individuals who are detained pre-trial, who still have their right to vote, have the lack of an opportunity to do so, but are very interested in doing that. Christina, it is your turn to go first, so we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think that is such a harmful myth and a deliberate distraction. In Massachusetts, the work to enfranchise and de facto disenfranchisement, and also end felony disenfranchisement, is led by folks who have been incarcerated and people who are currently incarcerated. So to me, that's all you need to know that it matters. And the reason I think it's often the idea that the problem is disinterest is kind of a sneaky distraction in a couple of ways. One, because of course there's going to be some disinterest if people think that they've been disenfranchised. In Massachusetts, the problem is not just that people believe they've been disenfranchised or they are disenfranchised when they're eligible to vote pre-trial or on misdemeanors, but folks think that they have been permanently disenfranchised, even when they never lost the right to vote in the first place. And that's one, like, we have all the research we need to know that prisons and jails are designed to make people feel like they're not members of society and suppress political participation. But the other reason that happens is because COs, probation officers, and parole officers in Massachusetts literally tell people that they have been or are disenfranchised. So that's kind of part one. And then part two, I think I get frustrated when I was mentioning at the start of this, I had a legislator recently express concern that low participation in prisons and jails in elections, if reported on, would make sheriffs look bad. I honestly get so like frustrated thinking about that. I like almost lose my train of thought. I think, yeah, I actually did totally lose my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
In short, it's absolutely a myth. And all I was going to say is that we're talking about people's constitutional right to vote and have access to the ballot. So whether there's interest or not, to me, one, there is, but the question doesn't matter. Like, this is a fundamental question of whether or not people should be afforded access to exercise a right that is protected by our Constitution. So yeah, I both disagree with the claim, and I think it's a distraction.
Thank you so much. Tony, let's go to you because I really, really appreciate you being here tonight, having this discussion with us because you bring such a unique perspective since you have some lived experiences. I'd be interested in knowing what that was like as far as these myths are concerned. I know you came home in 2015. Were there conversations regarding your right to vote and what that looked like from the inside, and your comparisons once you were able to come home, what that looked like from the other side in helping individuals to have the information, to gain the knowledge, and also gain the access?
Thank you, Professor Terry Crawford. Yeah, I can remember when Obama ran for the first time and sitting in a prison in the TV room watching that and wishing like I could be involved. Like this was epic for me, right? And so juxtapose that to like interviewing people in the jail after they had voted as to, you know, what it was like, because many of them have voted for the first time while incarcerated in jail. And so we have whole populations of people who have not been engaged in the political process before, right? And this is their first engagement. And so the myths, the myths are disastrous, right? Because you have people in Michigan, and it varies from state to state, which is, you know, America. But in Michigan, as soon as you are released from incarceration, you automatically regain your right to vote. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to file any petition, nothing. You automatically, all you have to do is register and you can vote. I know in some states that's not the case, but in Michigan, that's the case. But you still have parole officers in Michigan telling people, hey, you can't vote, because either the parole officer didn't know or they had some other nefarious motive. I tend to say people follow those myths, right? Because there's so much disinformation around voting. But what I'll say about the jail setting, that when I did all those interviews that I found interesting, even in a jail as progressive as the Genesee County jail, right, that had like upwards of 150 people vote for the last presidential election, right, that are held in the jail. What people said was that they didn't have a lot of information, because when you're in a jail, you're often locked in your room, right? And so you miss the news. Sometimes you're not out when the news is on. You don't, like the information we take for granted as people in society. Oftentimes people in jail just don't have that information at all, right? And so that's one of the drivers to low voter turnout, right? It's just lack of information. It's not that people don't want to get involved. Oftentimes it's just they don't know. And so one of the counters, and I'm gonna wrap it up. One of the counters in Genesee County was to bring in formerly incarcerated people as ambassadors and deputize them. The sheriffs deputize these men to engage with the population.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Darrell, why don't you go ahead and we'll circle back and talk about some things that each of you have discussed. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So, you know, when talking about these myths, you know, and Christina touched on this a little bit, I think a lot of times there's not an availability to even check, right? So, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I wanted to make sure I knew where the polling places were for me to vote. I could go on Google, I can Google it, I can call the county or the city clerk's office and I can get this information. You can't do that when you're at a jail. And in my opinion, you should be able to, right? So we have a lot of contractors, a lot of people that are making a whole lot of money off of people that are behind bars and their families, right? How much money is JailBased making, charging for nothing, right? For rights that should already exist. So why doesn't JailBased have an option to connect people with their county clerk or their city clerk? Why don't some of these different contracts, when the counties and when the cities are voting on these contracts, these are some of the consolations that need to be made by these companies that are basically vultures for this community. But there's a high interest. The first year we went into Harris County's jail, we registered some 230, I think was our number. In 2018, our number rose to 870. By 2019, we were at 1,300. That following year, even in the midst of the pandemic for a runoff election, we eclipsed our general election numbers the year before. So the more often we're going in, and they talked about this even in the documentary, you know, when you're going in so often, they see the shirts, they know what y'all are there for. They're coming up to you with questions. They already know what time it is. And so that reinforcement sort of makes it easy. Another thing that we noticed, people that were registering for the first time and that were requesting their ballot by mail, there were other people in the dorm, in the pod, able to help them fill out X, Y, or Z because they had the answers to those questions. And I think from a broader perspective, like that shows the magic of what is starting to happen. And hopefully we continue to tap into that because there's not a lack of you know, inspiration to do this. There's often a lack of a tool to be there to actually make it happen.
Thank you so much, each of you. Tony, you mentioned something very important about the automatic reinstatement, if you will, after they are returning home in Michigan. Right now in Nebraska, there's a 2-year waiting period until you've served all of your probation, parole, what they call off paper. So there's 2 years. Nebraska used to be one of those states where it was a lifetime bar. And there are still some of those states, as the three of you know, that still have a lifetime bar to your right to vote. Nebraska is no longer one of those states, but we do still have that 2-year waiting period. Christina, you talked about the civics class that one of the sheriffs was willing to institute inside of the jail. So I think those two pieces, if we could talk about what that looks like, because of course you could have those types of discussions in a civics class that have been established behind the walls, that this is what the law looks like in Michigan or Nebraska or Texas or wherever you are. This is what you should do when you return home. These are some individuals you should be in contact with. If there is no civics class, which there is not in Nebraska right now. So how did that happen, Christine? If you can talk a little bit about that. Was it just a very zealous sheriff that decided this was the right thing to do? Or was there in general a willingness to help this population participate in the democracy?
Yeah, so I do know that Sheriff Katujan, his dad was a town clerk, an election official. So Sheriff Katujan often talks about, you know, his commitment to civics generally and wanting to bolster political participation. I notice among some of the sheriffs in Massachusetts who work with us more, there's often, and I don't mean to jump right to the negative, but there's often more of an interest in ensuring that folks who go back into community know that they have the right to vote and participate, which obviously is so important. But I often get concerned that we should be paying a little bit more attention to access to the ballot while folks are incarcerated, because we know that anyone is going to be more likely to vote after they have already. It's the reason that there's this huge push for college and university GOTV efforts. The best way to make someone a repeat voter is to actually get them to vote. And if they're in your custody and in your care, my view is it's your job to make sure that they actually vote if your concern is civic engagement upon return. On that class, I know he had worked in particular with a group of League of Women Voters folks, and I think that was kind of initiated on his own. I think that one of the most important things that came up, I think Tony touched on in particular, so I guess the context in Massachusetts, you automatically do have your right to vote restored upon release. I want to say most people don't know that though. And most people, at least most people I've worked with and I know, think that they've been permanently disenfranchised. They also often don't have information on what address they could use to register They don't have information necessarily on how to register as a voter. I think that information, while having courses baked in, is really helpful. I think that's one of the places that sheriffs and the DOC really should partner with trusted messengers who can, I mean, I just want to point out another, I work with some folks who have talked about that they actually knew they had the right to vote while incarcerated in Massachusetts, but chose not to because they didn't trust COs on their unit not to tamper with their ballot or not to just toss their ballot. That kind of thing underscores that I think for the civic education piece, for partnering with whether it's, you know, faith leaders, in some places we work with people who run recovery groups, or folks who are formerly incarcerated or known, is just really important so that the information is coming, especially on civic participation upon return, is coming from folks who are trusted. But again, my view is the best thing we can do to improve participation for folks when they're released is to make voting accessible during incarceration.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I want to talk about the legislative piece for each one of you. We can send the volunteers inside the facilities as much as we want to, maybe even get the mail-in ballots to the institutions and hope and pray that they get to those that are detained and then they get mailed for them. But I think the most important part of this is to get the legislation so that there is actually a polling place inside of the jails. For a lot of people, they can't even imagine that this could happen, say, in a place like Nebraska, that there's actually a polling place inside the county jail. So talk about your experience as to what that push was like, some of the language in the legislation, whether or not you had any resistance in getting the election commissioner on board, what all of that looked like for you. Jarrell, I think it's your turn to go first.
Yeah, so, you know, Nebraska's a pretty unlikely place for this to happen. If there was a number one place where it would probably be unlikely, I would say Texas, right? One of the most conservative states. And, you know, we were actually fearful with knowing that the polling location was going to happen. And we knew that Governor Abbott had called 2 special sessions. There was going to be a third, and we just knew if they got a whiff of what we were doing in Harris County, it takes nothing to add an amendment somewhere to shut all that stuff down. So, you know, it really does take sort of teaming up, I would say, with organizations like Campaign Legal Center or some of these other litigation-focused organizations that are ready to be that backing, because at the end of the day, and we had a sheriff in a county that's a suburb of Harris County, right? That basically on a Zoom conversation like this one, basically said, well, our folks are just not going to vote this year. It's just not, you know, we don't have the manpower to make it happen. And it's like, it's the law, right? So, you know, I think in spaces like that, it's going to take, number one, advocacy from people, and you'd also be surprised who's actually for this, right? So when we're counting the votes, there was a bill by Sophronia Thompson in Texas that would have brought the right to vote for those currently on parole and probation, which I personally agree with. If someone is, I think everyone should be able to vote personally, but specifically to that, and it's surprising to see which legislators you wouldn't have assumed were in favor of it that actually were. So don't always count what do they say? Don't count your eggs before they hatch, because you'd be surprised. Right. Also be surprised those, you know, firebrands that you just know would be on your side, that even publicly may be on your side, that you later find out, you know, really sort of stir things up when it came to passing legislation. I know in both Massachusetts and Michigan would be both places that are closer to making this happen legislatively. So I'll yield to them.
Okay, Christina?
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, we just got jail-based voting legislation through the Senate, and it's now up in the House. Yay, it's exciting.
How long a process was that for you?
So we filed this bill in January, or our
Okay.
bill, the jail-based voting bill, was filed in January. There's also a larger election reform package that had some jail-based voting provisions in it, and we were able to get the pith of the more comprehensive jail-based voting bill, or I should just say more detailed jail-based voting bill, added to the larger election reform bill in the Senate. It now is likely going to go to a vote and conference committee not until January. The legislation that's moving still isn't, not to go right to the negative, but it's not perfect. We tried as best as we could to create an election day, exactly what we see in Cook County in Illinois, an election day voting option. But in Massachusetts, we run our elections on the municipal level. So if we wanted, what we wrote in our bill was a requirement that would have the 3 largest county jails have at least 1 polling location, but that would only serve, it wouldn't reach as many people as it would need to. So we're still relying really heavily on requirements around quick turnaround of absentee or mail ballot applications. There are requirements on sheriffs to actually appoint a staff person to oversee the entire process between a couple months before election day and election day. All eligible voters have to be handed a mail ballot application, as well as postage, prepaid materials on candidates, all of the rest. There are some things that we didn't see added to the Senate bill that I would have really liked to, but I think the most important thing that we were able to get in are some reporting requirements, which again, we've had pushback from sheriffs, but by including those reporting requirements, our hope is it will push sheriffs and the DOC to take a number of other steps to ensure that people can actually vote. It will ensure that election officials do due diligence and ensure that they don't unduly reject ballot applications. And it should also ensure that the Secretary of Commonwealth always does their part to make sure to basically oversee the voting process. So it's not perfect, but it would be a step forward.
Okay, thank you for that. Tony, can you talk some about the process in Michigan and what that looked like, and how you got your sponsor for the bill to bring it to the floor?
So we don't have any legislation in Michigan right now.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just going to hold off on just that discussion because it's not right yet. But I'll say that like the climate in Michigan right now is that we have a lot of legislation that has been dropping that is restrictive of voting overall. And so, but we do have we had a bill that was dropped to grant voting for people incarcerated within the Michigan Department of Corrections, which was a plus. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but that's a great conversation to have. I'm sure our legislation will be dropping soon, and we can come back and kind of talk about it.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So I'm going to go to Professor Hurd. I see our numbers have gone down slightly, so I want to make sure that we get to questions from the audience. So Professor Hurd, if you want to kind of vet any questions that we have for the panelists. I think you're still muted. We can't hear you.
All right, yes. So I'm looking there, we don't have any questions in the Q&A right now, but I did raise a question based on how difficult this process is, just in general. How much more difficult was this in the last election where there was an attempt to suppress voters? And do you see any problems with state initiatives that are making it increasingly harder to vote, especially with absentee ballots and ID requirements and all that, how does that make this process even harder?
Let's start with Tony. I don't think we've gone first with you in a moment, so we can start with you.
Cool. Yes, so obviously there's a nationwide campaign to have legislation drop in various states that restrict the right of voters. One piece of legislation in Michigan has some ID request, because in Michigan you have the right to vote by mail. And so some of the legislation that's dropped is an attempt to restrict that right with ID requirements. That could be, the governor already vetoed that, but I have a feeling there's a bigger plan behind the scenes, but that type of legislation would be problematic, obviously, to people in jail who vote by mail if the ID requirements were too stringent. And yes, it could be like a huge problem. It's something we're keeping our eyes on.
Okay, Darrell?
Yeah, in the state of Texas, it's really interesting because when the pandemic first hit, we had our county clerk, who kind of handled elections at the time, announced that she was resigning at the end of the month. We had just had meetings with her, everything was moving forward, and now she's going to leave. So we had a stand-in, a person that the county commission sort of put there in like a holdover until election time, and we just knew this holdover is not going to do anything that we want them to do. Well, we were surprised. He reached out and said, heard about the work that y'all are doing. We've got this pandemic. We're trying to figure it out too. If you had a magic wand, what would you do? I said, hang on, I got a Google Doc just for a moment like this. And so we went through that, and he was sort of thumbs up on everything. Well, some of the things that we asked for instance, having the county elections department to actually mail all eligible voters at 3 separate points, because you got to think, with jails, they're constantly turning over. Everyone that's there today is not there tomorrow. It turns over more than people could ever imagine. And so everything that we had asked for was a thumbs up. Well, guess what happened when the legislative session hit at the beginning of 2021? It's literally as if they got that same Google Doc and said, make a bill to shut all this down. So things like making it difficult for the elections administrator to provide ballot by mail applications. Now that's against the law in the state of Texas, right? So the government entity can't do it. Changing and sort of strengthening like who can handle someone else's vote by mail application. There's a whole host of things that are making it more difficult to make this happen.
Okay, thank you so much. Christina.
So I think, to start on a positive note, the one thing that I have seen happen as a consequence of the kind of renewed GOP push to restrict access to the ballot, especially for Black voters and voters of color, and is it has been politically mobilizing in some states like Massachusetts, and created a new sense of urgency around removing barriers to the ballot that disproportionately strip Black communities and strip communities of color of their political representation. So I have just found that, that is, maybe I'm reaching here for a positive, but that is an opportunity, this renewed sense of urgency. And I think also it helps people put jail-based disenfranchisement into the context that it deserves to be seen in, which is of our country's history of denying Black folks and communities of color a say in our democracy. On the downside, I definitely have seen GOP messaging that kind of will target efforts around jail-based voting and also felony reenfranchisement. That's unquestionably harmful. And then I think the other risk, I think the only caveat, I'm not actually sure, like in Massachusetts, incarcerated eligible voters are specially qualified. So while we have had a Republican legislator try and make voting harder for incarcerated people, they're technically in Massachusetts in a separate category of voters, so certain restrictions would impact them differently. And I don't know how that plays out in other states. But I'd say the other kind of collateral consequence of the voter suppression movement is that it can also at the same time that it can kind of create political mobilization around jail-based voting, it can also have the effect of putting jail-based voting, kind of lowering it a rung on the priority ladder. So I've seen both of those currents play out. My hope is that we can just continue to fight that effort, and then build off of it strategically to make clear that any efforts to push back around voter suppression have to include enfranchising those behind the wall.
Okay. Thank you so much. I want to make sure we have an opportunity to get to some of the clips. We've already talked about.
We have two questions now in the Q&A
okay.
from
Let's
the
go
audience.
to the questions then. Okay.
So the first, I guess, would be directed to you, Professor Crawford. What does this process look like in Nebraska? Do we know?
Wow, that is a very good question. And that was the whole purpose of us attempting to have this conversation tonight. So one of the things that conversations that I've had with Darrell and some of the other grassroots organizers he has given me information on is we need to start, I believe, at the ground level to make sure we have organizations on board who will help push this issue. The other part of it, and the three of you correct me if I'm wrong, but we're going to have to look at legislation in Nebraska. We're going to have to, and we don't have to recreate the wheel. It already exists. We just need to rework it and tweak the verbiage for what that looks like in Nebraska, get our sponsor and get it on the legislative floor. We are also going to have to get our election commissioner on the board, and I think he would be. I won't call names, but I have had conversations with the election commissioner, and I believe this is ripe for something like this to happen in Nebraska. Will it be an easy task? Absolutely not. But is it doable? I believe it is.
All right, and the second question is, who have you found to be the best messenger when working with corrections officials? Is it former incarcerated individuals or someone else?
That's a good question for the panel. Who wants to go first? I'll let you guys choose.
I can weigh in by giving, again, the League of Women Voters a shout out.
Right.
Sheriffs here and COs love working with the League of Women Voters. I think the other thing that I would, so one, two, this is sort of answers the question. It can be helpful. I feel like the tough game to play is I find that sympathetic sheriffs and COs like photo ops. So if there's a messenger who can provide, it's like finding a balance between the, like, we're gonna lift up, your great leadership, but then at the same time come in with a little bit of the, Campaign Legal Center teeth, the friendly reminder that this is a constitutional right. Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Tony, you want to go?
I think I'll echo what Christina said. I think it's a mix. I think sometimes people with lived experience are also messengers to correctional officials, but sometimes it could be a bit, I'll just say, antagonistic, just because we have that lived experience. Yeah.
Darrell, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I
Mhm.
would add to it that, as y'all are forming your coalition in Nebraska, people are going to come from different ends of the spectrum. That, when different versions of the bill, when there's a new amendment, when you're trying to get it out of committee, and some people are going to have to make some consolations. And sometimes that gets dirty when, some organizations or some individuals have some like no goes that are but you kind of got to do X, Y, and Z to get it through. So do we want that or do we want nothing kind of thing? And then I think too, you're going to have in your coalition the people that are best to speak to the community, and then the people that are best to speak to, some of your sheriffs or your
Yes.
who those people are, and then like understanding like whose role is which, because there's sometimes Cinderella in, right?
Right.
Cinderella in, it's gonna blow it all up, right? But then there's some cases where you send me in and it's good. So like really figuring that out and like maintaining that understanding that everybody's not gonna get like the bill that you wrote is not, it may not be exactly what it is, and like setting those boundaries and understanding what's our Cadillac ask, and then what's our minimum ask, and like keeping that communication going, because it can, get to that point. I'll tell you, even when it came to bringing the polling location to Harris County, as we got closer to it actually being implemented, there were some things that came out of left field, but it was too late. It was too late. For instance, we thought it was going to be open to everyone who was eligible, and we later found out that they had whittled that down to just the people who had been arrested after the mail-in ballot application deadline, right?
Okay.
So, and in my opinion, right, I'll say it on this call because I don't think none of y'all know them, I think that was the plan all along. I could see, I look back through emails and I'm like, oh, this was mentioned before, and they decided they were going to do that anyway. So based on that, what are we going to do moving forward?
Okay.
I
Are
do
there
have
other questions?
I had that was all the questions we have in the Q&A, but I do have another question because and it's one of the things that I've been thinking about in relationship to another event we're going to have in the spring. And so we've really focused, the discussion has mainly focused on the process. But I want to ask about the person, because people who are incarcerated really have been removed from society in multiple ways, not just physically, but there is a way in which their personhood has been removed. They don't feel a part of the community. And I wanted to ask how this being able to vote, being able to participate in this civic right that you have, how does that impact a person's ability to think of themselves as a person? And I liked, and I'll bring in the documentary because the Ronaldo Hudson, he said, I was a citizen before I left prison. I didn't become a citizen when I walked out of prison. I began to walk around that prison as a citizen. So it's like, I'm a person. I am a citizen of the United States, and this is how I participate in society. So how does this process help people who are incarcerated regain their personhood? Because I feel like that is also a part of rehabilitation. If you want them to come out and participate in society, you have to give them the tools and show them the process of actually being a person who contributes to society.
Awesome. Thank you for that question. Are you directing it to all three?
Anybody who wants to answer.
Okay. Any takers?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm pretty. There's a some pretty good data sets that talk about the more people are engaged in this type of civic engagement, how it impacts recidivism, and I think just on a more personal level, I think the more people that we get engaged in the voting process that have never been engaged before, I think we have more of an investment in community. Oftentimes people that are incarcerated, and I'm speaking personally, feel separated from community, right? Feel no part of it, and therefore feel no value in it, no responsibility to it, right? And so part of voting is that responsibility piece, right? That part of being a voice in your community, right? And I think the more we can tie that in, the more likely we are to change the direction of some people as their investment into community and feeling a part of community, really.
I see another question, Deborah. I don't know if you, okay. You want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. I just wanted to add, sorry. I just wanted to add on a couple of things that my coalition partners bring up. One is, Tony, on your point on community, there's also plenty of research that backs up that feeling part of a community is really important for general well-being, mental health outcomes, all of the things. Like if we're talking about recidivism, that are important for making coming back into society just a little bit easier. But the folks who lead this work in Massachusetts from MCI Norfolk care about voting for there are three main reasons I hear over and over. One is that it is a fundamentally hopeful activity. For the folks I work with who are serving really long sentences, it's a way to stay connected with their communities and feel like there is, they are part of a society on the other side that they have a say in, and so they're going to get back to eventually. The second reason is that a lot of the folks I work with are parents who want to have a say in the people who sit on their kids' school committee and the legislators who make decisions affecting, everything, all of, their families. And then I think the last thing is a lot of the folks I work with understand that they are incarcerated without, shirking any responsibility or whatever, but because of these gross systemic injustices. So being able to vote is a way to chip back at the failures of government that landed so many of the folks leading this work from the inside behind the wall in the first place.
If I could add to, behind those bars, whether it's one day, whether it's a week, whether it's a month, whether it's a year, whether it's years, you thought about what you wanted to eat for lunch today. You thought about what you wanted to wear today. There were a lot of different decisions that you got to make today. So I want you to imagine for days, weeks, months, years, it's almost like that movie Groundhog Day, right? Where exactly at the same time, it's count time, it's chow time, it's rec, it's this, it's that. You go to commissary, it's the same things that are there. So you're in this rotation, right? Voting gives you the option to make a decision. And just that act alone does wonders.
Okay.
All right, so in the chat, thank you so much for being here. When I talk to others about this great initiative, many fear that incarcerated voters would attempt to oust hard-nosed judges, sheriffs, etc. Number one, is this a risk? Number two, are those elected officials part of the blockade to this effort because they fear retaliative voting?
That is a very good question. I have my opinion on it, but I'm interested in each one of yours. So why don't we start with Jarrell, and we'll just go down the line.
Cool. When I hear, I think justice is supposed to be blind. And I think, when I hear hard-nosed judge, hard-nosed sheriff, I'm seeing handlebar mustaches, right? And I'm seeing sometimes these people beat their chest, right? In order to win elections, you know, amongst people, it's a lot of fear mongering. Let's just be honest. And let's be honest also that when it comes to people of color, Black people, right? And when it comes to people from certain neighborhoods, those are the people who now become the villain, right? For the rest of, you know, for these other communities. And there's no here to there or attachment to, you're going to have crime where there's poverty and there is no opportunity, right? And some of those same people are part of the reason why it's there in the first place. So I would say, yes, that is going to be that is one of the things that people will use. And speaking from looking at, you know, the different hearings that I've observed in the different states, that is usually sort of the pushback. You've seen, you know, district attorneys' offices and sheriff's departments and government entities to actually lobby against these opportunities just based on that, just, you know, acting as a retaliative, you know, blockade to voting. But at the same time, you do have those, you do have those that you wouldn't expect that would be on your side, and you just have to count your votes and keep it pushing.
Christina?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Darrell said. And I just say, yeah, a lot of folks raise those fears. Like, we have some legislators who will talk about, well, isn't there a risk of this mass mobilization that's going to vote me out? So yeah, some of those folks do serve as gatekeepers and barriers. Whether that's, you know, and then I think we should always interrogate where fears of incarcerated voters mobilizing broadly, you know, what that is about. I think that it's super racialized, especially when we talk about voting by those serving felony convictions or in the DOC custody. My second response is, like, incarcerated voters, the reality is incarcerated voters are voters, just like anybody else. As much as there's interest, you're not going to see 100% participation. And kind of related to that, like, if my feeling is, if a group of folks could get together and get that organized and vote out, you know, a sheriff or a DA or a judge, like, that would be a pretty cool campaign, and more power to them, because that sounds really hard. And then I think the last thing I'll just say is, like, the whole point of voting is that people who've been impacted by government, which is all of us, can hold government accountable. So my view is, why shouldn't somebody who's been affected by, you know, given an unfair sentence by a judge, or, you know, been denied access to, like, phone calls to their kid for a month arbitrarily by, you know, a sheriff's new policy, which is stuff that happens in Massachusetts. Why shouldn't those folks be able to organize and hold those government officials accountable? Because to me, that's the whole point of the voting process in the first place.
Thank you so much. And Tony?
I think it's kind of funny. It's kind of laughable, the notion that they're worried that they'll be voted out. That's kind of like the political process. If people don't like you for whatever political reason, right? That's just how it works. Secondly, for me, we're talking about people incarcerated in jail, and we're talking about people who are presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. So whether or not they're held in jail or out on bond, these people can vote whatever interest they want to vote. And I think thirdly, I mean, when we frame it in a bigger picture, the people that are disenfranchised by jail voting are the same people that have been historically disenfranchised in the voting process, right? These are the same people, poor Black people, these are the same people, right? And so I'm glad no one has brought that argument to me, because it would kind of upset me a little bit. It's kind of trivial, right? It's the stupidest argument ever. Sorry.
Just let me say this, I can see someone using that argument, and I absolutely agree with you, Tony, that it's a ridiculous argument, because if people are voting and you are in fear of being voted out of office, then that says something about you and maybe something about your behavior, and maybe a change in behavior is warranted as a result of that fear. That could be any set of voters, not incarcerated people that are detained pre-trial. It could be, Joe next door or Martha down the street. Any voters have the potential, and I wish we would do it more, that we would get a large coalition or a voting block to get rid of some of those people that we know need to come off the bench or come out of office. That would be a wonderful thing. That's my soapbox. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Darrell.
I was gonna really quickly. So the sheriff earlier, I wasn't gonna mention it, but now it was the Brazoria County Sheriff who basically said we don't have the manpower to do it. So like our people aren't voting. It's interesting because Rachel Barshak, who was the Brazoria County clerk. Brazoria County in Texas is a suburb basically of Houston. Long story made short, she immediately retired earlier this year, and it was kind of bizarre. We later found out, and it's all over the news, that she, the county clerk who decides who's on grand juries, who handles the elections department and everything, were putting only people who voted in the Republican primary or that lived outside of Pearland on grand juries. Okay. Wow. Now, just if you could imagine, Houston, Pearland starts growing. Pearland starts getting more colorful, right? One of the people in that office did a whistleblower, and you can look this up. It's Brazoria County, Texas. You'll see, and it's just shocking that this was allowed to happen, right? So if it weren't for this whistleblower, we would have never known, right? So months ago, when we were pushing to bring this to Brazoria County, and we were met with so much pushback, and only months later to realize part of the reason why. And where else is this happening? Where there's not a whistleblower blowing the whistle up. Can you imagine someone literally going through the rolls and saying, no, 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 based on which primary you voted on in the primary, and living outside of the new ethnically diverse Pearland? It's shameful.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Do we have any other questions, Professor Hurd? No? Okay. Maybe we have time to, where are we on time? Oh, we're at 7:30-ish. So if we could go to that last clip, and maybe we can get your response from each one of the panelists on the last clip. I think we called it number 5.
Community members in jail and prison, I've seen, have the most astute insights into our policy system, into our government system. They are affected by government decision makers every single day in big ways and in small ways. And law and policy professionals like me, we don't have a chance of actually solving any problems, actually solving any racial injustices, if we don't get input from people most directly affected. And we can try to draft laws or file litigation, and that's only going to be one piece of the puzzle that ultimately is not going to work if we don't have a glimpse into how the system actually works and what people actually need who are facing disenfranchisement.
Thank you so much. I think this goes to one of the questions that we had as to who's going to be the best advocate for this population, she said in the clip, and I believe most of you have said also that it's going to take both those that are behind the walls and those that are out in the community to advocate for this population, because we all have a responsibility to defend democracy. We all have a civic responsibility to make sure that we're casting our vote. And for those that don't have a voice, we also have a responsibility to see to it that they get their voices back through this process. So I think it's going to take all of us to do that. We can do this in Omaha, Nebraska, because we know what it looks like in Texas and in Massachusetts and in Michigan. And now we have some new advocates to help us through this process. I am excited about the possibilities of something like this happening in Nebraska. And again, we don't have to recreate the wheel because it has already happened in Cook County. And I think Cook County may be the poster child or maybe the model that everyone else can follow to make sure that it's happened. Although their jail population is probably 3 times ours here in Douglas County in Omaha. But that just means it's very doable. If they can do it in a larger facility, we certainly can do it in a facility the size of ours. So I believe, are we nearing the end of our time, Professor Hurd?
Yes.
If there are any closing words for any one of you about best practices as you worked through your process, either in any of the states that you've had contact with through the Sentencing Project, or each one of you in your respective states, what have been some of your best practices to move this towards the legislation and also move towards actually having a polling place? Because that's the ultimate goal, I believe, is something that we'd like to achieve here in Nebraska. Let's start with Tony.
That's a pretty great question. I think really getting a coalition together of willing partners and getting really into the weeds of what the state looks like, right? And knowing exactly how the state operates right now. So you can really identify what's happening and what needs to happen, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it does. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Christina?
I think I'll echo the kind of number one best practice is building a broad coalition that one has folks on both sides of the wall who can and already do in many states. I think often this work is like already ongoing and sometimes unrecognized, lend their expertise because we're not going to understand the reality of what disenfranchisement looks like and what comprehensive solutions look like without that leadership. I think having a coalition that includes folks who can specialize on, you know, the tricky election reform and election administrative side of things, having someone who can speak to some of, it's been helpful to have folks like Darrell with experience on the correction side to talk about what some of those system solutions, what barriers could be, what maybe easier pathways could look like. I think having, you know, advocates who can take on the lobbying work, having folks who can lift this up in the media, which thanks to the work of the Sentencing Project, I feel like each election I see more coverage of this work and of voting behind the wall as a fundamental elections issue as possible. And then, you know, of course, having grassroots support is important. And the only other thing that has, I think, can be helpful in some states is if there is, and this is, again, the value of having a broad coalition, not everyone needs to have the cozy relationship with a sheriff or with the DOC official, but having someone who can kind of take that on and also, you know, set a sheriff or DOC official up to be an early partner so that they can feel like this is an opportunity for them to lead and get some credit rather than be on the defensive. That's not perfect, holes in it, but I think that can be, it's often helpful if someone who's in power feels like something was a bit of their idea and they had early buy-in to. can just be helpful.
Darrell, as you give your answer, can you talk some also about the coalition call that, I don't know if you guys do it weekly or if that's, talk some about that and how individuals can participate in that call. Mhm.
Absolutely. So the last Wednesday of every month, 4:30 Eastern, 3:30 Central, we have our JailBased Voting Coalition call. Most recently, we had Ion Sancho, who was the election supervisor of Leon County, which is Tallahassee, Florida. Last month, we had Crystal Mason, who, of course, made national news because she voted while under federal supervision, didn't know it. The county allowed her to register. She voted and ended up in jail because of it. And so again, those are the last Wednesday of every month at 4:30 Eastern, 3:30 Central. And we also have a Facebook group. It's just facebook.com/jailbased voting. And so you can sort of see like other coalition members like sharing goings on where they are, media clips and stuff like that. And so if I like, it's kind of the whole adage of like, if I knew then what I know now, I would say specifically looking at it in Texas, if we would have spent more time building relationships amongst the coalition, I think that's very important because you're going to be spending a whole lot of time together. Two, I would say it's really important, and both Massachusetts does a very good job of this. They were meeting like every Monday at 6 consistently. So having those consistent meetings, you sort of get in a rhythm, and as different members of the coalition are doing different things, sometimes it's hard to know like what your updates are supposed to be. So like just that act of knowing like the rhythm sort of makes it easier. And then the last piece of advice that I would give, get to know staffers, because you'd be surprised how many times you could pull someone over to your side by knowing the staffer and being able to have that conversation and say, hey, what's the deal? And for them to say, hey, it's this part right here. And then for you to say like, oh, that's nothing, and call your coalition, or are we good with it? Boom, we're good. We got another vote on committee. So like, and like Christina said, like, can't say this enough, like a lot of elected officials like that attention. They like to be at the press conference. I mean, you'd be surprised, just a little, that goes a long way. And even with us, with the work that we were doing in Texas, it went a long way with the people that we pulled along. It was them wanting to be the first one, wanting to be part of this work that was going to get attention.
Okay. And
Well,
just,
can you put the information? I put the time for the call. Can you put the information for the call in the chat?
Okay, awesome.
All right. And so while he's doing that, I just wanted to thank all of you for this very, very important discussion. It's invaluable. Once it's uploaded, it will be open to the public. So people who were not on tonight will be able to access this. And I think that it will be something that they will find extremely informative. So we'll publicize this and make sure that people know that it's there so that they can log on and watch. For those of you who are following us, our work for this 50th anniversary, our next event will be on next Tuesday at 4:00 p.m. Faculty lecture, an intergenerational conversation with Professor Preston Love Jr., remembering the past, face-to-face with our youth. So we're hoping that you can join us. Again, thank you so much for all of our panelists tonight. We want to wish you all a very good night, and thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you to each one of you. Appreciate you. Have a great evening.